So welcome everybody to the latest episode or webinar in the Planning for Citizen Participation in Mission Ocean and Waters webinar series by PREP4BLUE. I think it's a special welcome to anyone on the Atlantic coast or from New Zealand today, just because of the unsociable time. You're very welcome, and all of you are welcome. So today's webinar is on citizen assemblies and deliberative processes for Mission Ocean. And we've just been talking before this began about how within the kind of Mission Ocean project community and Mission Ocean activities, I think this is the most requested webinar so far, and certainly one of the topics that we've been discussing most with colleagues at the moment. So, sorry, let me just change my slides. Just for those who are coming new to Mission Ocean, I'll just give a brief introduction. So Mission Ocean is one of the EU's flagship new missions. It's one of six that they have developed to kind of move away from a sector-oriented innovation policy towards a challenge-oriented innovation policy. And Mission Ocean's full title is Restore Our Oceans and Waters by 2030. It's got very ambitious goals within a relatively short time period. And up the top of this slide, by the way, I should say we'll share all the slides after this webinar, so don't worry about trying to take them all in. But these are its three overarching goals in terms of protecting and restoring the European waters, eliminating pollution, and making the blue economy carbon neutral and circular. And this webinar series is all about citizen engagement with the mission. So down here, taken from the mission implementation plan, I have a graphic of the 10 mission or citizen engagement target outcomes that they want to achieve by 2025 and 2030. And today's session is all about this one, trialing deliberative democratic mechanisms for co-design of restoration solutions. Not only restoration solutions, by the way, because I can show you an example of some of the activities that the mission has been funding. So Mission Ocean funding has come largely so far through the Horizon Europe yearly calls. And from other places too, but just as examples here, the calls every year ask projects to develop some sort of mission citizen assemblies or other democratic processes to involve citizens in their activities, be they restoration or around pollution mitigation or citizen science or other things like that. So today's session is going to be all about looking at how we can do that well. And within a project mold, because a lot of us in this space work within 12-month funding, funding rounds or otherwise 3-year projects. So we're going to be talking about how that can be done, something like a citizen assembly process set up and run within that time period. Just before we continue, I just said I might briefly define what a citizen's assembly is. And this is one thing that we have learned, I think, working in this space, is that this term is becoming well known and kind of good practice developed around it in the English speaking world, at least, but it's not necessarily understood and definitely not translated perfectly across Europe. So what we're talking about today, there can be many definitions, but kind of good practice around these processes are like settling on something that combines random selection, deliberation, and decision making on behalf of citizens. And ensuring diversity of the group in some ways, and being able to track that is also very important. And our facilitators today, once I introduce them, will describe their very good practice example of having done that. So that's it, diversity, so that citizens can reach informed decisions and make some sort of recommendations that the result of an assembly leads to something. So the session structure today is I'm going to present our facilitators now, who are going to discuss their very good practice example of a mission relevant citizens assembly that was delivered within a project mode. So it's very relevant to the work that we're doing. And then we'll discuss how Mission Ocean projects can leverage such an approach, but then they're also challenged by it, by the structure of the mission, the size and scale of Europe, the different member states, et cetera, et cetera. And so we'll talk about how citizens assemblies for Mission Ocean might be undertaken. So what we'll do, by the way, is we'll stop kind of halfway through, maybe after the presentation, just to take 1 or 2 quick questions, and then we can take more questions at the end. So with that said, I'll introduce our facilitators and thank them very much for being here, because they are from New Zealand and it's the middle of the night for them. So thank you very much for being here. I'm Christian Allen, Anne Bardsley, and Tatiana Buklihash, I hope I got that right, from the University of Auckland, New Zealand, Aotearoa. So thank you very much for being with us, and you can start your presentation whenever it suits.
Okay. I hope you can all see my slide. Oh,
yep, we
okay.
can see him.
Yeah. Okay, let's hope they get along. Well, thank you so much, Dave and everybody. And it's a real pleasure for us from New Zealand. It's not quite middle of the night, it's 9 p.m., so we should be okay. And I should say it's really great for us to participate in a webinar that's linked to European Horizon Europe project, because I should say that as of June 2023, New Zealand is now is able to participate in Horizon Europe project. So it's like we're actually watching this space with great interest. So before I get into I'll just sort of tell you a little bit what the plan is for, as you can see on this next slide. The plan for the next half an hour, 40 minutes for the three of us is that we are going to introduce a little bit our research center, say a little bit about the background to our Citizens Assembly on the next source of water for Auckland, and how we went from what was a research project about a process to an empowered deliberative process that changed policy in the city. We'll talk a little bit about building relationships with decision maker or government or whoever is in this space. And I think this is something that we can maybe talk about a little bit later. Choosing the right questions, then I hand over to my colleague Anne Bardsley, who will take you through the process and say some sort of quite practical things, how we did it and how we went through from kind of small pilot workshops to a bigger process. And then Christiane will say something about what happened afterwards and what was the impact and what we've learned and what we think maybe you can also take from there. So as I sort of like, just as a way of background, I should say that we worked in a research center and think tank called COI2, Center for Informed Futures, which is only 3 years old. And it's the whole point of this center, and it's a unique center at the University of Auckland to generate knowledge tools, as the slide says, to address critical long-term global national challenges. And we are particularly interested in those that are related to environmental, technological, social change, and we're very committed to taking a transdisciplinary approach, which means that we not only work with colleagues from other academic disciplines across the university, but we are also committed to working with partners outside academia. And I guess this is something that works with Mission Ocean overall. And what also means that we are trying as much as possible, and this is not always easy, to frame our research questions and design of research projects from the outset with our research partners, and also to really work on real world problems, or to sort of try to bring our research process and research questions to have sort of impact soon. I guess, I mean, they all do eventually. So history of the project. I just want to say that in our center, several people, including Anne and Christiane, worked in what used to be the Office of the Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Peter Gluckman, he was the chief scientist from 2009, 2018. I mean, Christiane and Anne were not there the whole time. And they come with a disciplinary background in science advice, science in policy, science diplomacy, I mean, as well as kind of earlier in anthropology and science. And my background is really in history and philosophy of science and science and technology studies. And I guess our research center, and you can sort of imagine that in a sort of this Office of Chief Science Advice is tasked with providing scientific advice, or kind of weighing in with regard to policy questions that may require input from science background. So we all had this converging interest in the ways in which political decisions are made on complex issues that often involve scientific knowledge and knowledge of technology, and then the role that was played by the public input. And I mean, I'm sure you can think of many questions. I mean, the sort of the issues around climate change and how to kind of get policy traction on questions, and sort of where science is relatively settled, but there's a lot of kind of movement around where people are, where policymakers are, what happens when governments change. So in our personal experience as science advisors and as academics, we could see how the government, and in particular after elections, would often launch into promising policy process, and only to stop when they perceived that they were maybe losing political support. And also kind of on the other side, we could see how public consultations would be often captured by organized groups. Also, they were often not very transparent, and often, you know, although they were ostensibly very open, you would actually often people who were directly affected were not involved in these processes. And this is what you want to avoid, in particular with regard to climate, if you want to achieve just transition. So one thing in New Zealand, and I think maybe it's more characteristic of Anglo countries than in continental Europe, that in addition to representative democracy, there's quite a lively culture of participatory democracy, which means that many policy decisions require substantial input of the public through mechanisms such as town halls and written submissions and online surveys and so forth. And this is something that has been in sort of policy fashion since 1980s, and New Zealand has been embedded in legislation since at least the early 1990s. The idea of all these participatory processes is that everybody can participate, and that everybody should participate who is involved. What, however, happens in practice is that often people who, not everybody does, only people who know how to participate, who have confidence, who have resources, actually take part. That often transparency and empowerment are not guaranteed, so they may, so people provide their views, you actually don't know what happens and what's kind of comes out, and how policy decisions are made, and to what extent this public input makes a difference. And also kind of the one thing is that these opinions are still aggregations, participatory democracy is still aggregation of individual opinion, sort of like voting. So it's not necessarily a decision that takes into account kind of collective good, which again, thinking about the future and environmental degradation and climate change is not necessarily the ideal way of making democratic decisions. So we were quite attracted with the field of deliberative democracy, and as Dave was mentioning, citizens' assembly are an empirical output or a format of deliberative democratic theory, if you want. And deliberative democracy is a field that's been developing for at least 40, 50 years. And on this slide, I tried to provide a kind of very brief summary of the 3 generations or 3 waves of deliberative democracy, starting with this normative writing by John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, and with a kind of emphasis on how on deliberation and informed reason giving within a group of people. And then in the 1990s and early 2000s, when political theory started to think about more what happens in the complex society, where there are differences in power, and not everybody in the room is actually occupies the same position in society. And this third wave that we're seeing today in the last 15 years is much more thinking about how we institutionalize these processes, and how, and there's a lot more empirical work. And this is like where this popularity of citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries comes through. And we should also, I mean, this is of course driven by the big complex policy problems that we have today of climate change, and those that are kind of linked to climate change and environmental problems. Of course, not only those, but these were the ones that driving them to a large extent. Now, I just want to say, so we kind of came to this thinking that we wanted to actually study deliberative democracy as a process. And here is just that, like, how in our kind of thinking, we were sort of puts participatory democracy on one side, how this was used in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and what we liked about deliberative democracy and what seemed as a sort of positive thing, and we wanted to trial it. So this is how we came to our research question. And I guess our research, because as I said, we came from the process side, is could we replace the current participatory processes with deliberative ones? What kind of policy questions should they answer? And this third bit is really like what also Dave talked a little bit about, that there is no one size fits all. In New Zealand, our particular issue that we are thinking very deeply is how anything we do involves and affects our indigenous people or Maori. And, you know, this is, I guess, something that each country in Europe will grapple. What are their particular local specificities? This project was funded. We applied for funding for the Ministry of Business, Innovation, and Employment Endeavour, which is just a kind of a research fund. And we got this Smart Ideas grant, which is basically a grant, sort of a short-term grant, with the idea to catalyze and rapidly test promising innovative research ideas that have a high potential to benefit New Zealand. And so we started our research project in 2020, and our initial idea is that we're going to run 2 very short research. We're going to test deliberative process on 2 fictional but sort of realistic questions. And these are the questions that we came up with. And this is what we initially wanted to do. And this is how we thought that our project is going to look like. It was going to be 2 years, and this is what it was meant to sort of very roughly look like. However, what happened, 2020 came, pandemic started, we couldn't really do anything. And in some ways, this was, I mean, like what we spent is actually the first 6 months is we just did a lot of thinking and talking to people. And that actually turned out to be a beneficial thing. And I think this is something that I actually also want to say, sort of be open to opportunities in relationships that may emerge quite unexpected ways. In a very coincidental conversation, we learned that Auckland's water utility company were very concerned because we were going through a very dry period, and they were very much aware that we will be looking at a sort of succession of very wet and then very dry years. And they wanted to come up with a plan on how to develop a next source of water for Auckland for after 2040. So looking really 15 years ahead towards a very different climate future. But they wanted to engage Aucklanders in a much deeper, much more open, more inclusive, and sort of better ways. So we completely pivoted and sort of tore about our research plan, went back to the funder, and luckily, because it was as I said, it's sort of a ministry that wanted to fund very applied research questions, they agreed for us to change our program and say that instead of like testing on these processes, we're going to actually do a project that was going to kind of unite this real life question and real life problem that what I had with what we wanted to do. And this was to, you know, sort of find the research question and test this deliberative process that hasn't been tested in New Zealand. So then over the next 3 years, and then I'll pass over to Anne, the project actually, we ended up having to extend it by a year. And I think maybe this is something to be aware as much as, and kind of keep sort of retain a level of flexibility as much as you can, because things may not turn out how you think that they will. And I guess this is, but I also want to say that this relationship and working had a kind of positive effect on the budget of because some of the expenses, some of the cost could be shared by our research partner. Okay, I'll stop sharing here and I'll pass to Anne, who will then take you through the project. I think you're muted, Anne.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry about that. Thanks for that introduction. I'm just going to be taking us through what we actually did in this project when we came to an agreement on this real world question that WaterCare wanted to answer, and that was what could be the future source of water for Auckland, given that the projections indicated that by the mid-2040s the city was going to need another large source of water. And we had a baseline of this question that we were not allowed, because right now Auckland uses some water from the Waikato River, which is in a region to the south of us, and culturally and for other reasons that we've agreed, or Auckland has agreed, not to take any more additional water from the Waikato River. So we needed to be thinking ahead about when we will be running out of water, and especially in that time, as Tatiana mentioned, we were in the midst of a drought. We needed to engage citizens in conversations about how we would get a new source of water for the future. So the first phase that Tatiana went over just very briefly, we decided to do small assemblies. So this was not a full assembly. What I've called this pilot phase in her previous slide, it was phase 1B of this project. We had that same question, what would be the future source of Auckland's water? But we decided to test out our questions, our background materials, etc., using 4 separate deliberative workshops, which we facilitated during July and August of 2021. And we did that using all the processes that we later used for the larger assembly, that is to randomly select our participants based on the population, the census data for the city of Auckland in those 4 different regions. So we did north, south, central, east, and west. So we had 4 workshops in 4 regions, so 4 different sortition processes. And if you need that explained, we'll get into that in a little more detail when I talk about the full assembly. But basically, we sent out, we used the WaterCare customer database and sent out invitations, thousands of invitations, asked for expressions of interest, did a sortition process to randomly select those participants, so that all 4 of these different workshops had a group of about 30 participants who were descriptively representative of the area where the workshop was occurring. So the process for this was exploring a few aspects. As I said, as a pilot before the big assembly, we didn't even know we were going to do a full assembly at that point, but we were testing for us our processes, and WaterCare was testing what people needed to know and how they might approach these rather complex questions that we were putting to them. So it was about participation and deliberation. So we were, as I said, recruitment of a representative sample, and how the process would work. And on the question of water, we were talking about the personal experience of water restrictions in the summer, and people's personal views regarding the extent to which water is a pressing issue for Auckland, and then their views and understandings of 4 potential future sources that we put to them. Let's go to the next. Oops, sorry. Went wrong way. Sorry, I've lost my slides here.
Yeah, I think you're going backwards, are you? No.
Oh dear, I'm not sure where they are now.
Maybe do you want to stop sharing and start sharing again?
Yeah, I'll do that. There you are. Okay, I'm getting back to the right ones. Strange. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
There's something very strange about how my slides are advancing. Sorry about that. Okay. Let's hope that they behave now. So our design, as I said, was to use deliberative workshops using random selection. These workshops did not have an empowered remit. So as I said, this is not a full assembly. We didn't expect, because these were short 3-hour processes, we just were testing out our questions and our materials and people's knowledge and what they needed to know in order to deliberate further. So as I said, we had about 30 participants in tables of about 6 per table, and we had postgraduate students as table hosts to help the conversation move. We also had in the room water care and university engineers and geographers involved as experts. Again, the question was, what should be the next source of water for Auckland post 2040? And I just want to emphasize that these processes also, even in these short forms, really we have to set down some ground rules and talk about what we mean by deliberating and how these processes are different from, say, town halls or other types of engagement processes. So these are just setting out for key elements that help participants deliberate. And that is talking about how these conversations we're open to hearing, coming into these processes with an open mind. You're going to hear from a lot of different perspectives, answer each other in a respectful manner, and give reasons for your different opinions. But they also involve that personal stake. And for us, as I've mentioned, was about how the drought in this case had affected each individual people. And because Auckland is a very diverse community, we had people who were not native to New Zealand, who could share their views and experiences from places that had even more water issues than we experience here in New Zealand. But it's also about, to take them through weighing the options, and I'll go through how we presented the different options that the citizens were deliberating on. In these short processes, we didn't have a lot of time for point number 4 here, which is about reflection, allowing the time for participants to reflect on what they've heard, identify those points of agreement, and talk about whether they have second thoughts on their opinions and where they might change their minds, and what other questions they might have in order to deliberate further. So that's really important in the full assembly that I'll get to in a bit. But this is an example of, we produced a booklet for the participants that showed them these 4 possible options that we were going to talk about. On the right side, you can see some of the criteria that we were asking them to assess and talk about these options in relation to the different criteria, because the source of water needed to be able to meet peak demand. It had to be resilient to drought, environmentally responsible, and it needed to be cost-effective or an affordable thing to do. The question mark there is about its social acceptance. So this was the big part of involving citizens in these questions. We had options, including this one, which is purified recycled water. That means recycled wastewater being used for, purified and used for, ultimately for drinking water. In this example, it's by indirect, meaning it goes through a storage lake or an environmental buffer, and then is repurified again before it goes into the drinking water system. There's another option that was put to the people, which was to use purified recycled water directly without going through an environmental buffer. So again, it was about testing that against the same criteria. In most cases, these would have been, and from the start, most people thought these were pretty awful ideas. If you just ask someone if they want to drink recycled wastewater, most will say no from the start. And so this is where we come into having all that technical input into what is a really hard question. And people originally might say, not at all. I don't want to even think about that. You can watch them step through the processes of learning and talking to each other, and then changing their minds about some of these options. Another one that we presented was desalination. And the fourth for these processes was just reducing demand on the system. Fact is that you can see on the side that none of these criteria bubbles are colored in green for this option. So it isn't really an option, and it's what most people would go to first off. And they have to talk through and learn about how, while this is a good thing to do to reduce demand, it isn't going to solve the problem. And so we still need to come to an agreement on another large source of water. And as I said, these were only 3-hour processes for this pilot phase, and our observations, some of our observations were that as far as community consultations, most of the people that in the room had very little experience with these previously. So we were tapping into regular citizens, but not those who usually get involved in consultations. Just when we found that this was a lot to do with how the invitations were sent out, and they were personally invited. You've been randomly selected. Are you interested in participating in this new process? And because we asked in the beginning, when we went into these workshops, we asked the people if we had, because we were already thinking about how would we do a longer process, and we asked them if we had asked you to give up not just one Saturday morning, but 4 full Saturdays and some time in between, would you have said yes? And most of them did not raise their hands. And then by the end of the process, in that half day, we asked the question again, and about 90% of them put their hand up and said, yeah, this was really great. We would do more of this, and we would, please ask us back to do it again for longer. So they do find it to be very empowering. We also learned a lot, which was useful for water care, about their experiences of the drought and what they knew and needed to know to really help answer the question that was being asked of them. So as we've said, we had sufficient time to raise questions in these processes, but not really sufficient time to explore or discuss the options. So we didn't get any kind of real time to even measure a change in attitudes about which options they would choose in that time. But the learnings from those pilots were enough to really encourage WaterCare, who was our partner and funder, part funder, as Tatiana mentioned. A lot of this was also based on some grant funding that we started with. So we did launch into a full citizens assembly. So you can take these things as separate parts. I mean, it depends on where you're starting from. We did find these pilot workshops to be very useful in terms of developing our materials for a full assembly. And they did engage the citizens in the questions, but we didn't get any kind of recommendations out of those. But we went on to develop a full citizens assembly the next year. So the timeline of this was about 6 months from deciding we're going to take what we know from the previous year, and we are going to run an assembly in September. When did we do it? Can't even remember the dates now. It was about 6 months lead in time for us to do all this work, which was still quite a lot. Even with all the information we had previously, it was a lot of time to develop the materials again and design the process, do the recruitment, etc. But we were asking the same question, and with the same basic criteria that we wanted the people to judge different options by and discuss. So for the recruitment, and this time we sent out 12,000 invitations, 4,000 by using the New Zealand Post database, so physical letters going out to 4,000 households. Those ones were skewed towards the suburbs that we expected above average percentage of rentals, as opposed to the 8,000 invitations that we sent via the water care database, which was would have favored homeowners. So we wanted to make sure that we had a balance of homeowners and renters appropriate to reflect the census data. We got out of those invitations about 320 responses, so close to a 3% response rate, which is pretty typical. So you have to send out a lot of invitations in order to get a real representative sample. From that 320, we put those names, we collected demographic information from the respondents and put them through a sortition algorithm from which selected for us 40 people to invite that were then reflective of the demographics of Auckland. In the end, we had 37 people go through the whole process. This is what the invitation letters looked like that got sent out, except for the return to sender, but that's we put a deadline, asked them to play their part in a significant decision for Auckland. We're looking for 40 people to inform decisions on our future water supply. And those who received it inside, they got a letter that had a brief introduction telling them what they needed to do. We were looking for them to express their interest in this really interesting process, told them very briefly what it involves, the amount of time that they would have to spend. What's in it for you? Well, we did compensate all of our participants. So a total for over the 4 days of $800 in the form of Prezi cards is what we gave them. And from this invitation letter, if they some places to go if they wanted more information, and a QR code or website or phone number for them to register their interest. And as I said, from that we got our 40 participants that were all called individually by a research assistant and walked through the process so that they knew that what they were getting themselves into. This is an example of the booklet that we prepared for the participants with some background information on water. And this was an important, this is the why question that we had to walk them through, showing the trends and in our population growth and water supply and why we needed this big source. So this is an example of the type of information that was given to the participants. And our agenda over the 4 days was firstly an immersion day where they were trying to understand the question. They had an Ask Me Anything session with experts and some learning sessions, and talked a lot about actually how they would even discuss and go through this to the point where they would be able to make recommendations. And we had a second day with more speakers, a lot of group discussions, exploring the different options. And in this time for the full assembly, we had those same 4 options that I showed you before, but we had a couple of others, and including anything else. So this was not a closed process that you just had to pick from what we are telling you, but they understood, the people understood what the background was, what the need was, and the fact that that water care had done lots of studies from 160 different possible options, and we are presenting you with some of the best ones to be choosing from. But you might have some better ideas. We were open. They were very open to it. But I will say from the start, which I missed in the very beginning, what was really important to this assembly was that the chief executive of Water Care came to, so this is the funding body, the sponsor, came right at the start and said, we want to listen to you. We are going to, this is a really important process. We're glad that we've got you all here, and we will have to have a very good reason if this deliberation all goes well, not to take on your recommendations. So it was this offer to the people that Water Care was listening, that this process mattered. So, it was quite a process. So they did start talking about the options, and there's a lot of technical questions to be answered. They also, for us, it was really important for them to understand, and they actually came to us asking more about the indigenous issue and what Mana Whenua or Maori people thought about these different options, because they realized they didn't want to make a choice that would then go against a Maori worldview and might get some pushback, and they really wanted to do the right thing. They've started to, over the course of this time, to really take on the responsibility of representing the citizens of Auckland, which came slowly, I have to say. But yeah, by the third day, at the end of the third day, that was when they were starting to get into groups and to write the recommendations. So that was only 3 days. We had a session in between where we took all their questions that they'd been bringing up during the previous sessions, and we got experts, mostly overseas experts, to go online and answer their questions in an online session. And the last day is when so by the end of the last day, they had a writing up of the final report and presenting their recommendations to water care. And one thing is important is about the space for these assemblies. This is called the Fale Pacifica. It's a room we used at the University of Auckland. It's a big oval-shaped room, and we were moving these chairs around in all kinds of arrangements all the time as the process went on. Lots of moving around the room, mixing the groups up. We didn't use tables very much in this process. People were working in small groups, using clipboards, talking, writing. As you can see in this photo, there are posters around the room, and we had them at different points moving around and talking to experts at each poster about the different options. And they had different guest speakers come in at different times. This is on the final day where we were setting up, and in the room you can see these posters are love it to loathe it scale posters, where they, in the next slide I'm going to show you what this looks like, how the voting, how the consensus building process worked. They physically went and stood around in front of these different posters on the final day when they were going over the recommendations. And our rule was that because this was a consensus process, the people, I'll just go to this slide. This is the love it to loathe it scale. It measures how comfortable they feel with a particular recommendation. And a recommendation was not going to go into the final set unless we had at least 80% of the group at least living with it. So when I go back to this slide, you can see a gap here. We needed people all to be standing over on the left side of this screen from at least living with it. And through the whole process, this was really about people giving reasons for their views and listening to each other. And there was quite a lot of change on the last day over the recommendations, because as I mentioned earlier, two of those recommendations were about recycled wastewater, which initially was very much a yuck for a lot of people, but they did quickly learn about how the purification system worked and how safe it was, and convinced themselves that it was fine, but were very worried that the rest of the citizens of Auckland would not be happy with that recommendation, because they didn't know what this group then knew. So they were first holding on to the option of indirect recycled water, putting it through the environmental buffer. They thought people will be able to deal with this better. That's what we're probably going to recommend. And they started on the last day asking all kinds of questions to the experts, a lot of fact checking, and kind of thinking about the timeline of everything, and decided quite, in this sort of aha moment that this was quite a long process. They're still talking about something that was far in the future, but that they needed to plan for now. And And they realized based on those criteria about its affordability, its environmental impact, and its drought resilience, etc., that actually the smartest option was to use direct recycled water, because they didn't have to build another reservoir, they didn't have to go through the process of purifying it twice. The process was, the implementation was far enough away that the Aucklanders could be educated in the meantime. So there was this sudden shift when they sort of went, and we saw everybody moving, not 80%, but 100% of the group moved at least to live with it at the end. And so that's what this is them still talking through their recommendations, really, you know, fine tuning, editing, voting again. So it was quite an interesting process. And this is just a show of what they actually wrote for their final recommendations to the Water Care Board. And the main recommendation was about direct recycled water, and but also it was important in the implementation that we needed to start educating the Auckland population straight away that this is what they were going to do if they were going to implement it. And there were several other recommendations about education around water, the value of water anyway, that we needed to get those going, and still keep options open for things like desalination and other options should they be needed in the future. But their main recommendation was using recycled wastewater. And this is the chair of the Water Care Board and the chief executive over on the right side, congratulating the assembly. This was on the last day. They actually put that report together. They presented it to the board, and the board accepted it. And I'm going to hand over now to Christiane to say what happened next.
Yeah, and just leave your slides up. I only have 2, so could you just do them?
Okay. Yep.
That would be easier than fiddling with what others.
Sorry, I'll share again.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, so just some summative comments from me about the outcomes of this process. You can change slides, and what we're taking away from it as well. So, of course, as Anne said, WaterCare basically accepts the recommendation and kicks off its public education activities right after that. So as you've heard at the very beginning, we had a fairly empowered remit, really, that said we'd have to have a pretty good reason not to implement the recommendations of the assembly. And so when they heard that, you know, that was the signal that that WaterCare, the utility, was really taking this seriously. And then by the end, of course, it was just as measured an approach, I think, from WaterCare, saying, yes, we still believe that we'd have to have a pretty good reason not to implement this. It's you know, after the deliberation and the learning and the consensus building that went on. So there was some real trust there that was shown on both sides. And then the commitment from the water utility was really about keeping the assembly members, but also obviously the public, really apprised of what their next steps would be in terms of implementation of these recommendations. So one of the things we haven't talked about yet is the sort of media around this. The assembly itself had some coverage. The WaterCare results and acceptance of the recommendations had coverage, and this was all part of, you know, needing to ensure that transparency around the process. And so very quickly thereafter, WaterCare started to build up a website around what purified recycled water means, to make that available to the public. I just put up a couple of examples from their pages there, but you can see they're doing like a sort of a Q&A around it. They're showing where else it happens in the world. We're not the only ones, you know, contemplating implementing this. So really, again, as Anne said, it was about taking the time between now and when it would actually be built to educate the public, to build up that understanding, to be able to respond to any issues or questions that come up in that time, but educate. And that was a key recommendation that the assembly had come up with. And then what we found from the process in terms of our role too was that there was a real sort of snowball effect from, water care having sort of taken the opportunity, or some might say taken the chance to do a process like this. There were a lot of questions from other public agencies, from government, from ministries. Now that we had, I guess, a run on the board, so to speak, we had a win with this one, and others were asking us, well, how can we repeat this? How can we do this? So, for instance, the process was described in LGNZ, which is Local Government New Zealand. It's an agency that serves local governments and really helps with best practices and policy, training and resources for policy practitioners at the local level. And so this process from the utility was featured in that. Subsequently, too, we've had requests from city councils and regional councils, as well as other authorities, to run processes on different questions. We've just completed one around the future of transportation in Auckland and how to try to reduce vehicle kilometers traveled, and what public transit might, how public transit might have to be adapted as well. For that one, these are all, there's a spectrum of types of processes. So it's not always necessarily the consensus building as Anne described. It might be something like, a deliberative and learning process. So you use those ingredients, but you finish with a vote. And so it's still an aggregate of personal opinions. And so that consensus building isn't there. So we've had some pretty good practice with multiple types now. But I'm just mentioning this to say that, it, again, I guess it comes back to, it's not always one size fits all, and it's about the question you want to ask and designing a more bespoke process for context. You can change slides, and I'll just go do one last one, and then we can hand it back to David. So yeah, so lessons so far. I mean, these are, I guess they've all been mentioned in one way or another, but it's worth maybe just summing them up. Be clear on the aim and the question. Be really clear on whether this is the type of question that lends itself or that even needs a deliberative and community co-development process. I think we can probably agree that most of the policy issues that we deal with, I think Tatiana mentioned this, that we deal with these days are these really big, difficult, kind of intractable questions that need collective action. And if that's what you're dealing with, then yes, oftentimes this is the type of process that can really start to get at what collective action could look like. And you get that. I really don't like the term buy-in, because that's not what this is. But you are able to provide sufficient information, sufficient time to deliberate, and that opportunity to iterate with experts, which really does change hearts and minds. So yeah, just to be clear on the type of question that you're asking lends itself to that. If you are deliberating a range of options, of expert-driven options, as we were in the water care, consider those pilot phases to sort of test that framing, which Anne had gone over with you. There are, of course, some essential ingredients, which we've talked about, the recruitment process, the power of the remit and how that's designed, the whole learning process, that opportunity to iterate, deliberate, to learn both together on the day, so to speak, but also asynchronously by reading, by having the same material in front of them, but doing it at their own time and their own pace. And opportunities in between to interact with experts via Zoom sessions. So we gave a range of learning opportunities as part of that learning ingredient. And then, of course, this facilitated deliberation, which was really key. And in many cases, also a facilitated consensus building as well. But even though those are all common ingredients, it's not necessary that they all always look the same, and those can be adapted for different contexts and to different questions as well. We were very lucky in having a strong commitment from our sponsor, and ideally you would want to go to the decision-making level and get the commitment from whoever is at that level in the sponsoring organization in terms of your remit. we talked a lot about our planning and the 6-month process leading into this, and then even before the preliminary pilot phase. So good planning and process design is essential. And of course, we'd be happy to, going forward, respond to any queries about that in more detail. And then and great facilitation. For this process, we had a professional facilitator from I'm going to get it wrong, IP2 organization or IP2 trained facilitator, which is always very helpful to have. In other processes, we have done them sort of in-house, so to speak, but that again depends on context. And what we have also found is that the experts are, of course, being from a university, we have great access to experts, and we also had great reach to experts through the university systems internationally. And we were delighted to see that experts are almost always keen. They jumped at the chance to help. And interestingly, it was often something that sort of helps to meet their own kind of impact imperative that they're getting from, they're getting word from their funders as well, that they need to do this kind of engagement. And it met that criteria for them. It was a huge advantage, and obviously we benefited. And so just briefly on what's next for us. So we really do, some of the things that I think Tatiana alluded to that we're really thinking deeply about is, this is a pretty labor-intensive process. It's deep learning, deep engagement, very local, even if it's dealing with big, broad national or transboundary questions. And so we're looking at the issues of scalability. What can we add to the mix that can be partly online? We've been looking at more digital solutions for this, asynchronous, etc. And so we're starting to combine different tools, trying to get at different features of the process, but how it can be scaled. The second thing we're really thinking a lot about, as Tatiana said, is what these processes look like in the context of Aotearoa New Zealand's evolving governance landscape, and understanding where and how we work in partnership with Māori land authorities called Mana Whenua land authority holders. So they play a very important role in partnership with the New Zealand government, and this is something that we're looking at. What are the most culturally responsible and culturally appropriate ways to do this? And again, as you're localizing your own processes in different contexts, that's something to think about, and to co-design with local sponsors. And of course, the other pieces of work that we're doing is supporting others to design their own processes and sharing our knowledge, and sort of promulgating the opportunities and the benefits of and the potential of deliberative democracy processes with officials. There's been, as I said, a snowball effect of what we've done so far, but we've been really delighted with the responses from different levels of government coming to ask us more about these and how they can be applied in other policy questions that they're working on. Because at the end of the day, we've sort of shifted, or we're at least seeing a shift from government elected officials saying, wait a second, this is about decision making, that's my job, isn't it? To instead starting to see the utility of this and saying, oh no, these are really difficult, wicked problems that actually bearing the burden of being the single decision maker on them is quite a lot, and it makes sense to really allow that public voice to come in more strongly. So I'll leave it there and hand it back to David. And that's us for now. We hope to hear some questions later.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that presentation, and just describing that really, really thorough and well-designed process. Yeah, like Christiane said, anyone with questions, please feel free to put them in. We can take one or two now, or we can take a few more after my presentation in about 10 minutes time. I might just quickly ask you, I mean, there was so much there, even around the importance of choosing a topic, the importance of transparency and, communication through the media. I think one thing that stood out to me was the buy-in you had from the decision maker from the start, you know, kind of really empowered the whole process. And I'm just wondering how you developed that relationship, and maybe the importance were the, you know, the preparatory workshops, I suppose, if you want to call them that, very important in kind of demonstrating to Watercare that this was going to lead to something valuable, or how did you build the relationship?
Yeah, I would say that those, because in the beginning we only committed to just giving it a try, and we thought, well, this is how we'll do it. We'll do 4 different areas. We'll see if they're different. We'll test the process. We didn't have a whole plan at that point, even to do the full assembly. So that was helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it helped us to sort out our methods as well on that particular question, but it really, having Watercare there in those sessions, observing people talking civilly, changing their minds, having really great conversations, and actually asking really great questions, I think that made a big difference to the organization. And we have another example Christian mentioned about transport in Auckland, and we've just done, and similarly I've done one with the Ministry of Transport. So we're doing a lot on infrastructure here because it's a big long-term question. How is it funded? How do we do it? What do we want? What do we want to see for the future? So those are really good questions for these types of processes. But we have done something similar, not quite the pilot. I did those types of pilots for the Ministry of Transport. And it's amazing for them to be in the room and watching people have these discussions, and how excited they are to be involved. And they actually can see that the people in the room end up with a better view of the sponsoring body than they had to begin with, because Watercare didn't have a great reputation going into this, and people probably had bad things to say, and they came out of these, even the pilot processes, going, wow, we didn't really know any, you know, because in those ones they really heard from Watercare engineers who were just read straight up, this is how it is, and answered questions in the best way possible, didn't seem biased in any way, weren't trying to lead them in any direction, and really, so they benefited from being in the room and watching that, and even having their people there to be able to respond to things. And the same has happened with Auckland Council and Auckland Transport, who have a very, very bad reputation in Auckland. And yet we've had this assembly where people, you know, really came out of it going, wow, we didn't really realize the scope of the problem, and we understand now, and we you know, we want to be involved and really be helpful. So that was a little process that will lead to more with because we did one, as Christian mentioned, we did a brief one just recently that was more like a deliberative poll, where we surveyed their attitudes towards changes that would help to reduce the car dependency in Auckland. And without any learning, we wanted to know what they thought of various things, some of which were not very popular. And after the deliberative forum, where we did for 2 days, quite in a similar way for the longer assembly, we asked them again another survey, and we could see definite shifts, and also in the qualitative data that we got from those conversations, what they said, what they wanted, how they felt about those processes. So, and also having the council and Auckland Transport in the room, this is just building on that, so that Absolutely. I think in the future we could move towards a more empowered remit for some of those questions.
Yeah, can I just add one thing to Anne's response? So we mentioned that it's important to have the highest sort of level decision maker, ideally giving you that remit. But one of we did really benefit from an early relationship with a champion for deliberative democracy within the utility company, right? So we worked very, very closely with sort of senior analyst level and DG level in the engagement kind of sector of the water utility. And that was a really important relationship, because we knew that they could work closely with us, but also get things moving on their end and make sure that they could get that remit and that buy-in from the decision makers.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, that's really interesting.
There were a couple of questions that maybe would be a little bit easier to answer live. One was what we think, what shifted Valerie, what shifted people in terms of committing to contributing more times. And this is what Anne mentioned, that when we asked them at the start, they said that they wouldn't agree to spend several Saturdays, and then they said, I think what sort of seems to be the case, and we did do a more formal survey at the end of the assembly, we didn't do that at the end of this workshop, was that they all valued the time spent. I think it was positive in, I think, for several reasons. One was that Vodacare was, as we said, was very transparent in the sense how this decision was going to be used. One of the things that many people resent about participatory processes is the lack of transparency. What does their participation mean? What does this consultation mean? What's done? It was very clear from the start how this is going to be used. And there was a very clear commitment to that. So I think that they thought that this time seemed well spent. I would also sort of think we need to also think about like the positive social context and actually the value of creating these social connections with people in the context that sort of promotes actually talking in a very respectful way, which is very different from the ways in which conversations in particular about transport and climate take place on sort of Facebook pages or on social media. So I think there was quite a big contrast between, and that's what people liked. So yes, having experienced shorter ones, I think, you know, people were kind of seeing this, and this is, I guess, this is also the literature argument about deliberative democracy, that the way to grow it is actually just having more processes and more people experienced in different kinds. And there was another
yeah, if you maybe just want to take Jose's one for now, and we can take the rest after. So Jose was saying, how replicable is the process, and what are the lessons learned, maybe, you know, what really came up through the process that can be used in Europe? I mean, I'll talk about the mission context now.
This is the European process.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, Habermas is very much European, right? It's a kind of a little bit like, I mean, these processes have been done in Europe, of course. I guess it's really, the question is like, what are the local specificities that you need to think about, right? And we can't, like, we as was Christiane said, and, you know, we talked about, like, for us, really the big question is the relationship with the local indigenous people, with the land. And the fact that in Auckland, 50% of people were not even born, like, none of us here was born in New Zealand, right? You will not find this necessarily in a European city. So I mean, it's changing, but it's quite, so it does, so sort of really thinking through who are the people, what are the, like, what is also the kind of the history of the political participation in your country, because it will be different. Like, New Zealand has quite a long history of participatory democracy. It has a relatively long history of deliberative attempts that haven't been successful up to this point, and it's quite interesting. Successful in the terms of policy uptake, and it's quite interesting to sort of then understand, like, what does your particular place or country, you know, need, and what is the right way to start, really, because I think, you know, it might be quite different in Eastern Europe versus Ireland or something.
Absolutely, and depending on what's going on in this context, in, you know, national level in terms of Mission Ocean activity, and I can talk about that now. So thanks very much. I'll wrap this up just with kind of 10 minutes talking about the mission, and we can take one or two more questions then. So if I just go back to sharing my screen, give me 1 minute now. So, sorry, give me 1 second. I'll just fix this. No, that's better. So obviously what we heard there is a very thorough, good practice example of how to implement a citizens' assembly at a relatively local level, at the size of a city. Now, Mission Ocean will challenge that in certain ways, and some of these things are kind of immediately replicable, I suppose, or upscalable, and other things are not. Or there might be things to talk different things to think about when, say, for instance, you might be trying to develop some kind of deliberative process on a multi-state level or a basin level. So we'll talk about some of those things now. So first of all, and I think this was touched on a lot in the presentation, is the importance of picking the right question or the right topic to work on. And I think in terms of Mission Ocean, there's a balance to be struck between making sure that the topic is mission relevant, but then also relevant to the people that you're working with. So for instance, this is a map of the 4 sea basins as the mission in Europe, as the mission outlines them: the Atlantic, Arctic, the Baltic and North Sea, the Danube and Black Sea, and the Mediterranean. And Mission Ocean has picked one focus topic, one focus objective for each of these basins. It must be said, this was, in the first instance, this would have been done with a participatory and deliberative process. But now these have become, the kind of focus objectives. So in the Arctic Atlantic, or in the Atlantic Arctic and the Danube, it's restoration, it's pollution in the Mediterranean, and it's a carbon neutral and circular blue economy in the Baltic and North Sea. Now, so, it would be fantastic, for instance, if Citizens' Assembly that was taking place in Ireland was all about restoration. However, that might not be the thing that's motivating communities on the ground. For instance, if there's offshore wind development plans and are currently being undertaken, that might take over a process. And I think space needs to be made. And the mission is aware of this itself, that although there's focus objectives in each basin, that doesn't mean that the others aren't important. And so I do think that being aware of what the mission wants to do, wants to achieve in different regions, but also being aware of what populations and citizen participants might want to achieve is very important. I can also link after this, the mission has published baseline documents on each basin that outline, kind of at the beginning of the mission, that outline, I suppose, the state of the basin, the state of citizen engagement specifically, actually, is a chapter in each basin, and the experience of it in each state, but then also specific issues, what's kind of already been moved along quite a lot versus what really needs to get going. So I think then that might be another place to look at to find relevant topics. So then thinking about the scale is also important. Can I just ask, can you still just see my presentation now, or can you also see my notes? Just the presentation?
Just the presentation, yeah.
Fantastic. I don't have to wing it. So thinking about the scale, I think, is also very important in Mission Ocean projects, because you might have to think about whether you want to set up local initiatives yourself as a project, or set up something, so like in at the level of one member state and develop a process and seek and then give recommendations on how it could be upscaled, or would it be better to develop processes that are multi-state that can that run at one time? And there's definitely pros and cons to doing it either way. So obviously, if you do a cross-basin assembly, so say one that straddles the Mediterranean, that you'll get that networking and the transnational element already into the process, and that's very important in terms of the Mission Ocean, because it's not, and especially the topic, given oceans and waters, they're not the kind of things that stop at state boundaries. And the EU and the European Commission itself is very much likes to work in a kind of a multi-state, cooperative manner. So you get that straight away, and then as was touched on in the presentation by the ladies, maybe you could perhaps use online elements to kind of get that wider participation and collect some broader data. Now, one of the difficulties, I suppose, of doing that is how are you going to get how are you going to guarantee the diversity of participants? And I noticed there was a question in there about, can we describe representative sampling a bit deeper? I suppose in the water care example, that was done very well. So I suppose representative sampling is a way of guaranteeing diversity by using demographic data of, for instance, in this case, it was Auckland, to make sure that, and then picking, the invitees based on that, so that the people that you get, the participants in an assembly, are representative of the demographics of the society that they're representing. In this case, it was Auckland. So I suppose that's kind of the best practice, a particularly strong way of guaranteeing the diversity in participants. Now, that might be challenging at the level, or if you're doing it across several member states, because depending on the states, perhaps demographic data, different types of demographic data might be collected differently in different countries. Censuses will have taken place at different times, and in different years. And generally just the immediate availability of doing that, you know, of kind of constructing a mini public that's representative of a basin level population might be quite difficult. So I suppose the thing you have to think about is, if you're not doing representative sampling, what other steps are you taking to ensure that there is diversity there? Are you at least mapping the kinds of populations that exist in your areas? Are you, you know, I think as at the very least, you know, you need to develop some kind of process around guaranteeing the diversity, or you know, attempts to get that diversity in the people that you're going for. So I suppose also to think about then in terms of local initiatives, and when I say local, I suppose I mean either local on the level of cities or maybe national, because on the level of member states in the European Union, because we're dealing with 27 states plus associated countries in terms of Horizon Europe. So I think in terms of the local initiatives, there's a few things to think about. One of them, and this has already been alluded to, will be the different experiences of democratic or of deliberative processes. So doing a bit of research into each local context will be important before you pick one. And as I was saying, even the definition. So for instance, I know a lot of like Arctic communities have quite a long tradition of deliberative democracy, you know, when decisions will be made through town halls where kind of, you know, anyone is invited and decisions are made kind of, you know, as a group like that, which isn't the case in Central European countries, you know, who have kind of larger representative democracies for a while. So it's, you know, there and some have different experiences of including, I suppose, deliberative processes in decision making. So being aware of that and accounting for that is important. It's also very important, I think, to do research into what is going on in terms of Mission Ocean relevant activity within each state before you make this decision. So, for instance, Ireland is at the moment the Irish government is drafting its legislation that will allow it to set up the 30% marine protected areas by 2030 that Mission Ocean requires. And all of the signs and what the government have said so far is that it's reference to a participatory and deliberative process will be written into that legislation. So, you know, in terms of setting up those conservation and restoration activities, there will be centrally run deliberative processes. So if you want to work on restoration in Ireland through a citizens' assembly model between 2025 and 2030, it's probably valuable to link in with that process and to engage with those decision makers, rather than setting up something completely separate that works kind of in tandem with it. So having that kind of local level knowledge, I think, is very important before you make these decisions. So do some research on the different states and the different regions that you're working in. Just a note on language, yeah, maybe to continue the language and cultural difference. If you're like, you know, how to get this networking element in, you know, in Mission Ocean is kind of obviously a pan-European policy framework, and how to get this kind of networking element or the multi-state element when Europe is multilingual, because the idea of assemblies is that they're supposed to be inclusive, and that usually would mean that they're run in the local language. So for instance, I mean, if, you know, running a multi-state assembly in English language creates a challenge for that, because not everybody can speak English. So what might, you know, how might you deal with some of these things? So I mean, one option is to set up a lot of local level assemblies in local languages, and then projects themselves that are running these can act as the I suppose the networking element or the international element. So perhaps each assembly feeds back recommendations, and then the projects themselves, you collate this in some way and come up with kind of a super recommendation or something like that, coming from all, or at least describe the differences and coming out of the different processes, which would be very interesting. I suppose the downside of that is thinking about legacy, because all of these projects that we tend to work in come to an end after 1 year or 3 years or 4 years, whatever it is. And there's always an issue with, you know, people move on, funding stops, and if, you know, if processes like assembly processes come to an end themselves towards the end of projects, there is an issue there about responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that the recommendations coming out of such a process are driven on, like given to the decision makers that they're supposed to, and actioned on? So that needs to be thought about. And there is, you know, perhaps it's perhaps within the mission ocean, it's about passing it to another, passing recommendations to another project that's upcoming. Perhaps there's a role there for the mission implementation platform or the mission board itself. That the mission board will be there for the lifetime of the mission. It's a European Commission level board or something else. So just thinking about that is also very important. And in terms of ensuring diversity and inclusion, it was noted in the presentation there previously that there is a cost of attending a physical assembly, and in Europe these could vary highly depending on which state you're doing it in, and for different people, whether there's travel involved, is there childcare involved, time away from work. So integrating that, thinking about how people are being compensated for their time, and maybe integrating, and the way you could do that is in a project mold, I think, is perhaps you need to think about integrating attendee grants into the funding proposal at funding stage, so that's already set out for you. And just finally on the cultural difference thing, there is a lot of cultural difference within Europe, of course. And as I was saying at the start, we definitely found this when we were planning our project among our project team, that what is described in English as a citizen assembly doesn't translate readily into a lot of other languages, or there is at least not a perfect definition in many other languages for the process that we're talking about today. And so it's not only a language thing, but it is also a cultural thing. Like we're saying, it's like countries like Ireland, for instance, have at this stage have a long, I suppose, a lot of experience with these kind of democratic processes leading into constitutional change, for instance, constitutional referenda. Other countries don't yet, and so I think that needs to be acknowledged, and there definitely won't be a one-size-fits-all kind of mission ocean citizen assembly mold that works across every topic and every member state. And so that level of flexibility, I think, in terms of how people are chosen, topics they work on, the mold of the assembly itself, is something that you need to attend to when thinking about the locations themselves. And just that issue of translation, even at project level, we found one of our first jobs was translating citizen assembly into the different project languages, and making sure that we were all talking about the same thing, because we realized that at the start we definitely were not talking about the same thing when we were talking about citizen assemblies at the start, even within our team. So then how are you supposed to advertise that across the European basin, maybe? So that's definitely something to think about. And just finally, on process length, so I would say in terms of Mission Ocean and Mission Ocean projects or activities, definitely don't be put off. There are examples that take years to undertake. So like, for instance, the Irish-led ones, that the centrally managed ones that take years, that end up changing constitutional questions, are under a year to undertake. So that was like today's example from Auckland, just about, although there was prior work done in pre-engagement workshops, I suppose, the year previous. And in preparing for this workshop, I found some European Commission websites that had reported on citizen assemblies that took place as part of European projects that took a handful of months, and the participatory element took place within a day or two. So I think there's no reason not to engage with deliberative democracy and within Mission Ocean, and no reason to fear those elements in Mission Ocean funding calls, because they can be done, and they can be done within a project mold. I think the main thing for Mission Ocean is to remember that Europe is very geographically large and culturally diverse, and for that reason, I think it will create mission-specific challenges, but and make it so that that a one-size-fits-all approach will absolutely not work. But I think the main thing is to do research and be clear on why you've chosen the approach you've chosen for the states or the context or the question that you've chosen it in. So I think that's it from me for now. Sorry, hold on, let me just stop sharing.
I was just going to follow up, Dave, on your point about the length of these processes and how quickly they can be done. This one we referred to on transport that we've done recently was put together in a matter of months, which felt a little crazy, but it is possible. But for those types, we weren't going to expect an assembly to come up with recommendations, but we were able to easily survey a population, a group, and see changes in their decisions after that process. So that was a relatively short one, and we intend to. So those are types also that you could supplement with online participation, which we are doing as a second phase for that one.
That's excellent. Thanks very much. So I'm just looking at the time, and it's especially very late for you guys in New Zealand. Maybe we just there's one more question there. We can take that. And thank you, by the way. I can see you've been answering them as we've been talking. So thanks very much. We have one here from Maria, specifically on Mission Ocean. Incoherent policies or strategies linked to the ocean might influence how deliberation can take place. What kind of systems are considered as a given, such as, for example, economic growth, can influence the extent to which deliberation, or what kind of alternatives can be put forward? Does anyone have any comments on that?
I mean, I can try to address that really quickly, just because I have experience not only with these deliberative processes, but also working on I guess a smaller, any scale in New Zealand is going to be smaller than a European scale, but on a similar challenge-driven project around sustainable seas here in New Zealand. And I want to contrast these two processes because in some ways, going into a deliberative process, I think there is, or there at least has to be, some discussion on what is our shared understanding of the problem. So we talked about how the question is framed at the outset, and I think that that is really an important piece of it. If you don't have that initial shared sort of paradigmatic understanding of the problem, then there is a lot of, or there is potential for, disconnect in the discussions, or the need to take some time to kind of get on the same page, so to speak. So the fact that, this question is around, how do we ensure that people are seeing it in the same way? Is it about the commodification of the ocean, or is it about restoration? Is it about the ecosystem? And so taking the time to understand that and to go in with that shared understanding is, I think, really important. But I do want to contrast that with this separate research project that I've been working on, which I think really echoes the Mission Ocean project. So this, the Sustainable Seas National Science Challenge here in New Zealand has been a 10-year project. It's the first time that any kind of funding commitment has been given to doing something with that kind of horizon, any research funding commitment with that kind of horizon. And I'll just mention here that going into that initial, when that challenge was launched, that funding challenge was launched in New Zealand 10 years ago, the government did frame it as, how can we extract resources from our oceans in a sustainable way? So it was very much that commodity sort of based initiative, and using research and expertise to figure out how to do that. Over the course of 10 years, what has happened is an evolution of that initial shared understanding of the problem to turn it into, well, if we're going to do that, we must first start with an understanding of ecosystem-based management. And I mention this only to say that ecosystem-based management crystallized a new way of thinking about the entire problem, and that changed everything. And so I'm just contrasting these two situations. That took 10 years to get to that change. That they had the luxury of time, but it did make a huge difference. In a process, a deliberative process, I think there needs to be an understanding at the outset of being on the same page. Of being on the same page, yeah, no, thanks very much. Okay, great. Look, I think we'll leave it there just because the time is running on, but thank you so much for your time today. That was a really interesting presentation and really, really relevant. And okay, yeah, would you mind emailing me your slides, because I'll send them out as well, and so that everyone just can, and we have your contact details and everyone if anyone wants to contact you. But thanks so much for everybody who's been listening. We'll be back with more of these webinars after Christmas, and so we'll advertise them soon. And all the recordings are available on our website. This one will be put up within a couple of days. So thank you so much for joining today, and we'll see you all soon. Cheers.